It's working.
There we are. Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Two Beards and a Bible. I'm sitting here with Dave Tenney.
And I'm here with little John Slano.
There we go. All right, so we just figured out where we left off.
Yes.
We were in Acts 14, and we left off at verse 7, so we're going to pick up at verse 8,
Yep,
correct?
absolutely.
Okay, so Acts 14 at verse 8 is where we begin, and this is a man is healed in Lystra.
Yep, so I guess we'll read through 18.
Okay.
You want to read or
Sure.
you want me to read?
Yep, I'll read.
Okay.
So starting at verse 8, and in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonoan language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all the things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them."
Wow. Well, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So here you've got Paul and Barnabas. They come to this place, and was it Paul and Barnabas? Is Paul? Yeah, I believe Paul and Barnabas are still hanging out together here.
Yeah.
So they come to this city, and there's a man who's crippled. And of course, he's been crippled his entire life, it says. And the one thing I find interesting, Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed. Now, that's the first time I have heard that worded that way since we've started in Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently, in this situation, this man's faith had something to do with his healing.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the Gentile woman had faith too, right?
Right.
Who touched the hem of Jesus's robe.
I would call it that he saw that the man was very much interested in spiritual things and had faith insofar as belief and a desire. I mean, when you look out into a crowd, you and I have both stood in a pulpit.
Yep.
And you can look out in there and you know who's paying attention.
Yes.
And who's into it, and you know who's waiting for lunch.
And who's looking at their phone.
Right. Right. You think we can't see those things.
The one that gets me is when you'll see two people and they're showing the person next to them something on their phone, and they're both like,
right,
nodding their heads or laughing.
Let's hope it was a Bible verse. But nonetheless, you can see those things in that person. So I would say that given the context of all the other examples we have, and knowing what we know about these gifts that these men had, this man's, although he had faith, I would still say it had nothing to do with him necessarily being healed.
Yeah, I would agree with you.
It's
because that's just not. I mean, we just don't see that.
Yeah.
That ideal of faith being a qualifier for being healed anywhere else.
Right.
But
this man's faith was such that it was worthy of mention.
Yes.
And it undoubtedly, I would assume, from what we're reading here, I think it's right that we can assume that that his faith was moving in so much as Paul saw him and felt for his situation.
Yeah,
and understood that this man is hearing us.
Yeah. I think this is one of the situations where, so it says Paul observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand up straight on your feet. I think what we're tempted to do sometimes is to look at that and say, oh, you have to have faith to be healed.
If you take that verse all by itself,
right,
and you were to read that verse to somebody that didn't know the context of the rest of the scriptures, they would be led to believe that way.
Yeah. Now, it could be that he did have faith to be healed. It could be.
We don't know. I would just hold to from seeing how it is.
Yeah.
That it was, the healing was done through the power given to Paul.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the man's faith was mentioned.
Yeah, and it was in this case, it may have been part of it. It may not have. Mm-hmm. But it seems like it was in this instance. But you can't. The point I was going because you can't make a rule up.
Right.
Because then how do you explain all of the other times when people were healed without faith?
Right.
So I guess that's the only thing I would make with that one. Okay. So this man gets healed and he leaps up, and of course, if you lay down for like a couple of days, you don't leap up.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's that we've mentioned this before. That's in direct opposition to what we see with those let's just call them what they are, hucksters today.
Oh yeah.
That say they can heal someone.
Yeah.
They would, say they've healed someone and say it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And
that's not what happened. He leaped up.
Right.
So, everybody, was it like, is it Lyconian? I hit that word like a brick wall when I was reading it. Lycanonian? Lycanian? I don't know.
Lycanian. I like that one. Lycanian language.
Yeah. Anyways, those people from Lyconia, that's what they spoke. Mm-hmm. So in their own language.
Those of you linguists that are listening can enlighten us.
Yeah. So they want to attribute the things that Paul did to Zeus and Hermes.
Yeah.
And does your translation say Hermes? One of the other translations has a different name there. And
Jupiter.
Jupiter
and Mercury.
Jupiter and Mercury.
Mercury is Hermes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I looked at some other translations when I was
the only useful thing that I've gotten out of a Disney movie.
Oh, really?
Back in the 90s, that Hercules movie. The Mercury guy, the Hermes little guy with little wings flying around, and that's what. And my dad has an old Mercury with the picture of that that guy on it. That used to be their logo.
Yeah. Wasn't there? Was he crazy about a Mercury? Isn't that an Alan Jackson song?
Yeah.
So they attribute these miracles to these other gods.
Yeah.
And what's the problem with that?
They were just men.
Yes.
Just like them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this has happened. This is a recurring theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are some that when they see this, they immediately attribute it to something other than, what the very people who are doing these things are telling them of Christ, and yet they won't listen to them. And that speaks to humankind and how easily they can be duped into falsehood and how hard it is to get them back out of it.
Yeah.
Once they're in it.
Absolutely. And, it's almost like a test of faith for Paul and Barnabas because, hey, it would have been pretty easy for them to say, oh, yeah, let's go get the fatted calf because I'm hungry.
Life would have been easy for them if they had purported to be these guys.
But
until God got a hold of him.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the priest of Zeus, he came out to him and he brought oxen and garlands, and he was going to sacrifice to him. And I read that one of the reasons, I guess there was one of the mythologies was that I think it was Zeus had come down to some town and he needed help and nobody would help him, but there was an old couple that helped him, and he saved the old couple but killed everybody else in the town.
Huh.
And that was like I guess a fable or something that those people knew at that time.
Yeah.
And at any rate, that may have played into some of this. Are like, oh, well, we're going to make sure we do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Paul and Barnabas hear this, and they tore their clothes. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to be just a call. I don't think we do that too often today.
No. Yeah. But that seemed to be something that. Would that have been something amongst the Jews that showed their distaste for something?
Yeah, I would imagine.
I don't know that it went into correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember a person who was,
I think that was just an ancient practice.
just
It seems
in
to me
general
that,
in society.
It seems to me that I remember reading something when I was studying Roman history that this was a practice among Romans as well. It was a ancient, just a cultural, like sitting in sackcloth and ashes, or feet washing, or these are just like kind of ancient practices that we don't necessarily do today. But we get the idea of it even today, that he was really upset.
Right. You would maybe liken it to, in a situation where you're trying to really make a point, maybe you throw something on the ground or something, or stomp, or maybe something
punch
like
the car.
That. Well, I suppose I would never
never
hurt
that?
the car.
So I felt like it, John. Oh man. So Paul and Barnabas get them stopped from doing these things. And they basically say, hey, we're just men too, and they attribute the things that happen to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where we left off. So now it's interesting what happens next, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So these people want to treat Paul and Barnabas as gods, and now I'll read, start at verse 19. I'll just read a few verses here. It says, and the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, which is just where Paul and Barnabas were having some problems. And having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. Now, they wanted to make Paul and Barnabas gods, and now they're stoning them.
Just how fickle.
Yeah.
And quick-tempered, is it James that speaks of being driven by the wind and tossed?
Yes.
And that's what we're seeing here.
What about the guy who leapt up, who'd been crippled his whole life? What about him?
Right. So they probably wanted to stone him too.
I guess, yeah, no kidding. I guess since I only read a few, I'll go ahead and read till the end of the chapter.
Oh, okay.
It says, and when they had preached the gospel in that city, this is Derbe, and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with the fasting, they commended them to the Lord, in whom they believed. And after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. Now when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. Man, there's a lot of cities here. From there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended by the grace of God for the work which they had completed. And when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, so they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So it seems like, they kind of started off at Antioch, and now they're back home again.
Right. One of the things that was mentioned there in verse 22, towards the beginning of where you started reading, it says, "We must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God."
Yeah.
And that's something that we can certainly take to heart today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We live a pretty easy life.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I think, it really sheds light on the idea of many will come but few will enter, when we realize that when the going gets tough, like none of us have ever seen in this country in our lifetimes, that's where your faith is tested, and it may be through many. In this particular situation, these guys absolutely. We read about all of the troubles that they had to go through.
Yeah.
But
well, I can't help but think of we had the whole thing with COVID, where everybody was told to stay home,
right.
And how many people just stopped worshiping God, stopped attending services, because they were afraid of dying.
Right.
And that's what it boils down to. You're so afraid of dying that you abandon your faith.
Yeah, and some, in the moment, there are some certainly that did that, and then even continuing after. I'm hearing, thankfully, not among the brethren any brethren that I'm very close with, but I've heard stories of brethren in some places that have never returned. There are some brethren that I know that have not darkened the door of the assembly.
Yep.
Since before COVID, and they're still afraid.
Yeah.
And that was always my. I said it so many times during COVID, and I still say it from time to time. If if we're claiming Christ and our hope is on eternity, then what do we have to be afraid of?
Right.
I mean, that's perhaps in some cases easier said than done. I suppose, ask me on my deathbed and I'll tell you, but it boggles the mind that we're seeing people that were so fickle here turning with the wind and tossed, but the Lord's people are supposed to be different than that.
Yeah. But you still see that going on. Mm-hmm. I mean, we read about these things, in the pages of Scripture, and sometimes you think, "Oh, I can't believe these people are like that." Well, they're just like people today, exactly the same. In the same situation, people will do the same thing.
And we learned something. If we're going to take anything good out of this COVID thing, we can see that how weak we were at times during those, and fool me once, but ever comes around again, we ought to do better. Yeah,
certainly. Even if there is a chance of dying because you're going out and you're worshiping God as we've been instructed to, well, then there's no better way of dying than that.
Right.
Than fulfilling the will of God, right?
Right.
So.
And it comes down, it's a question of authority again, when it comes down to, the government says stay in your house, God says come together and worship me. Yeah. So who's got the authority there?
Exactly. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
So they went through. So this next verse 23 says they appointed elders in every church and prayed with fastings and commended them to the Lord when they believed. I always find that an interesting thing because it seems like today it's a hard thing to find elders in a local congregation.
It is.
But in the Bible, we read about Paul going to these churches with fairly new. I mean, these converts couldn't have been more than a year or two old, right? And they're appointed as elders.
Right. And that was certainly of necessity then, because there was nobody that had been in the faith for a long time,
Yeah, sometimes I think we make it harder than it should be.
Yeah.
you know.
And I think in some cases, we to add to that thought, not we make it hard for other people sometimes, but also sometimes ourselves we make it harder than it should be, and we're harder on ourselves than perhaps we should be.
Yeah. And you can speak to this because
I
you
can.
are an elder. So.
Right, and I can speak to the idea that I racked my head and my heart for a long time over, am I old enough? And have I, am I truly, ready for such a thing? And, it really does come down to, do you meet the requirements? Do you have a desire?
Right.
And, that's all the further we can go.
Yeah.
And I had some good elders in the faith that, in other assemblies around the country that helped me come to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Help coach me along and help me see that the thing that was pretty clear in the scriptures.
Yes.
But we have to take the scriptures for what they say and not announce more, announce less.
Yeah. I recently had a conversation with another man who was another elder in the church, and I was talking about myself, and I said, I said, sometimes I don't think I have what it takes. And he said, oh, no, you do. So
right.
That was actually encouraging to hear that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a responsibility that that men have to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And
when we, that's part of counting the cost, when we submit to that baptism of Christ.
Yep.
When we are, giving our life over in effect to the Lord in that way through obedience to Him, that's part of it.
Yeah.
Understanding that if we haven't already messed up to the point where, because there are things that we can do early in our lives that carry over and disqualify us from service in the church. If we haven't already done some of those things, then we need to do everything we can to be ready and available to step up when needed.
Yep, absolutely. So they gathered, they got through all of that. They did a lot of traveling. They got back to Antioch, and they made a report of the things that were done. And there's this new thing in here, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed a long time. So we saw that with Peter and Cornelius' household, and we see, so Paul obviously had that same information, and he must, they converted lots of Gentiles as well.
Yeah.
So, which, hey, I'm really thankful for.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in verse 28, so they stayed there a long time with the disciples. I imagine there was a lot of teaching that needed to be done.
Oh, yeah, and probably just, all of the things that would happen. There's also lots of things to tell about.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see how we are in town. Oh, we can get through this next little section. So starting in chapter 15, let's read through, I guess we'll read through 5. Okay. That'll get us started on this. We'll have to finish it up next week.
All right. So starting Acts 15 at verse 1, and certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So being sent on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, describing the conversion of the Gentiles, and they caused great joy to all the brethren. And when they had come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that God had done with them. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up, saying it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses.
Okay. So this is obviously a hot button issue at the time, because apparently, so it says certain men came down from Judea. I'm imagining, Paul and Barnabas are there in Antioch still. Mm-hmm. That would, from the context, it would seem like that's the case. So they were in Antioch, and some men come down from Judea, and they're teaching that they need to be circumcised. And Paul and Barnabas knew this was not correct, right?
Right.
So that's why it says there, Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputed with them.
Right.
And I guess the reason I make that point is, go ahead. You got something good?
No, it was just a note in my Bible leading me to Philippians 3:2, which says, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's speaking of circumcision.
Okay,
I suppose, but
yeah. So Paul and Barnabas knew that this was not a thing that was to be binding. But it says Paul and Barnabas and certain others, so it was determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others should go to Jerusalem to the apostles about this question. So I don't think Paul and Barnabas were going to go to Jerusalem and talk to the apostles and elders to find out if they were right or not.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure that, you know, as it says, they had no small dissension and dispute. I'm sure that they were going to, you know, gain the help of the elders.
Yeah.
And, you know, to get some help to combat this thing.
I also think maybe that because it says whoever, it doesn't say who determined. It says they determined that Paul, so it must have been the elders there at Antioch.
Yeah.
And probably the reason they said that, it was probably like, okay, we're in a big argument here. Right. And this isn't going to be settled if we just keep going the direction we're going. Right.
And that's, you know, that's the way, what do we do? What do we do with disputes within the assembly today? How is it supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to
the elders.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's only fitting.
Yeah.
That they do things instead of, like you said, just staying there and fighting and causing a stir. They probably had hit that point where they realized, you know, we're talking to the wall here.
Right, exactly. And those people were from Judea.
Right.
So maybe they're saying things about that the apostles are actually teaching these things. Mm-hmm. So it says that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them, so it sounds like some of the people from the congregation there were going to go up with them, and they were going to hear what the answer was.
Right. I was just kind of looking back to Acts 2 to see if there's anything in that sermon on the day of Pentecost that would have kind of cut this thing off at the knees, this idea of circumcision. But I'm not finding what I'm looking for. I mean, you go to Colossians and you know, see that, but
absolutely. And you know, in that Colossian letter, what the first couple of chapters are basically about the old law being put away, right?
Right.
So, I just gave my invitation Sunday night, Colossians chapter 2. But you are Hebrews too, the Hebrew letter as well. Chapter 8, verse 6 looks like, right? So, the apostles, Paul and all of them, they go up to the church there, and it says that some of the Pharisees rose up. Mm-hmm. So they said it is necessary to circumcise them and keep the command long. So, you know, the Pharisees, and they were definitely, I guess, the ones that tried to keep the law closer than anybody else.
Right.
And obviously they're probably still hanging on to it. Did you find it?
Yeah, it was around 8 verse 6. Speaking of the covenant, which was of better things, and the new covenant being written in their hearts.
Yeah.
You know, just basically saying that those old things are done away with.
Yeah. Well, that's where we're going to stop at here.
Okay.
And we're going to pick up here next week, and we'll really dive into all of this stuff.
Yep. I have a feeling it's starting to it's going to get a little bit more feisty.
Yes, it's going to. All right.
All right. Well, thanks for joining in. We'll see you next time.